by this campaign, and it's quite a privilege to be here to be briefly part of it. I've been asked to talk about the backstory for the Lansley Act, what the Act means, and what I think will happen and what we should do about it in under 20 minutes. I promise to try to do this. Dismantling the NHS began the day it was inaugurated. Conservatives, hard-right conservatives, were determined from that day on to reverse it. We have historical evidence for that. They always dreamed of returning health services like other services, like train services, bus services, electricity services, and so on, back to private ownership and private profit-making. And their ideological reason has always been that private is efficient and public is inefficient. But what really drives them is deeper than that. The ideology really conceals something else. The ideology, in any case, is false. The evidence is extremely clear, unassailable, that private provision of health services is inefficient, costly, and poor quality, reduces quality. What really drives them is a psychological disinclination to pay for other people to have what they themselves can afford. And I had a very interesting example of this 2 weeks ago. I was talking to my son who works in Canada, and he was at a meeting with some American businessmen, and for some reason the question of healthcare came up, and he said to an American who was there, who was banging on about socialized medicine in Canada, but he said, look, it makes sense. I mean, wouldn't you prefer to be part of a system where it was cheaper for you, on the quid pro quo is that everybody gets it as well? And the American said, certainly not. I'd much sooner pay more for myself than have to pay for anybody else. And that was a very interesting statement, you have to admit, which conservatives in this country are a bit less crude. But I really believe that the determination to bring this about springs from a pretty deep, class-driven feeling, which is not always acknowledged. However, unlike the other services that the Conservatives nationalised in the 80s, the NHS is a matter of life and death, and people understand this, and this makes it very difficult for people, or made it very difficult for people to attack. Thatcher realised this and resisted pressure from within her own cabinet to begin dismantling it. So instead, the process has been incremental, gathering speed under New Labour particularly, but it begins back in the Thatcher years, and certainly particularly in the major years of the 90s. 4 stages. First of all, NHS services were reorganised into separate businesses called trusts, hospital trusts, ambulance trusts, mental health trusts, and so on. Secondly, the whole thing was split down the middle between suppliers of services called providers and primary care trusts, which were the purchasers, the local arms of the Department of Health. And thirdly, this set up a so-called internal market, which was really a dry run of practice for pushing the NHS into a full market. Thirdly, payment by results was introduced so that every treatment now has a price and is separately billed for, which was necessary if you were going to allow competition, if you were going to invite private companies to start bidding for bits of the service there. It had to be priced in that way. And finally, NHS trusts were turned into foundation trusts and cut loose from financial support, in theory, from the Department of Health. If they go bust, they have to close. They were then ready to be part of a regular market. And that's how matters stood when the coalition came to power in 2010. So what did Lansley's Health and Social Care Act, which came into force 3 weeks ago, add to this? I think there are 3 main things. First of all, it removes the responsibility of the Secretary of State for Health to provide an NHS. It is now up to two kinds of unelected bodies, unaccountable bodies, something called NHS England, which until recently was more appropriately called the NHS Commissioning Board, and two clinical commissioning groups. It falls to these two organisations, one controlling the other, I would say, NHS England controlling CCGs, to decide what healthcare we will get. It's no longer up to the Secretary of State, and we have no access to control these people, they're independent. Secondly, an equally unaccountable regulator called Monitor, appointed by the Secretary of State and his personnel drawn from private healthcare sector, is mandated to prevent anti-competitive practices, or to put it another way, to promote competition, which means forcing clinical commissioning groups to put more and more services out to tender for private bidders to bid for them. This is the meaning of the regulations that were rammed through the House of Lords yesterday by coalition peers. 145 of those peers have a financial interest in a private healthcare company which directly or soon will stand to benefit from what they voted for. This is the most astonishing democratic or anti-democratic moment, and it's like old corruption. It's like England was before 1832, and it's something for us all to ponder what we're going to do about that. Thirdly, the Act gives NHS England power to go on requiring clinical commissioning groups to do what the government wants and to use the NHS budget in ways that may will, I think, in my opinion, hasten its breakup into a private market with a strong private sector component. An example of this is the consultation on personal health budgets, which closes tomorrow. I would be grateful if those people who know about this consultation would put their hands up. Interesting. It's been on since February, and I've yet to meet anybody who knows about it except one person who told me. And I wrote a piece about it last week on Our NHS, which is a thread of open democracy if you're interested. The idea is that anybody with a chronic disease, that's to say an ongoing non-curable disease which they can live with provided they're looked after, will be able to ask to have the money for that paid into their bank account, so they can then purchase the services they want, where they want and from whom they want. There are 15.5 million people in England alone with an ongoing chronic disease. So if only 10% of them took that money and gave it to non-NHS providers, that is a very serious hole in the income flowing to those previous NHS service providers. This is really an open door to another route for moving resources out of the NHS and into the private sector. And if you want to protest about that, you've got 12 hours left to do it in. Typical government consultation. Of the form, of course, this is what we plan to do. Do you agree or not? Yeah. Okay. What all this means, I think, is the beginning of the end of a free and equal and universal healthcare system. And how will this happen, in my opinion? What will we notice first, and what can we do about it? There won't be a tsunami of hospital privatizations, as John Lister has very cogently pointed out to me in his writing. Operating a full range of district general hospital services is not a profitable activity. To make money out of running a proper full hospital with very expensive, highly skilled teams, expensive equipment, and treating high-risk patients, you would have to charge phenomenal sums beyond the reach of anybody but the people on the rich list, Sunday Times rich list. So most private hospitals don't do any of that. They do diagnostics and some standard surgery. They have fewer than 100 beds, and even then they don't make a lot of money. On the other hand, NHS hospitals are being run down. They are being degraded by pressure from at least 6 sources. One is debt, which has already been touched on, PFI schemes especially, which no responsible government should ever have agreed to. Secondly, the so-called efficiency savings program, which in fact is being achieved not through efficiency but through staff cuts, through the salary freeze and through the rationing of treatments. The third pressure on hospitals is these new regulations which will force clinical commissioning groups to put services out to other bidders, and if other bidders get them, the resources will flow away from the hospitals. So hospital finance directors are facing a serious potential hemorrhage of funds to run the rest of the hospital with. A fourth pressure is the pressure on A&E services, which the Royal College of Nursing attributes to factors that I found a bit implausible, such as the winter beds crisis. I was sitting in the garden contemplating the sun and thinking, wait a minute, that can't be quite right, because the pressures are there right as we speak, and we don't seem to have winter beds with a winter crisis. I think it's coming more, as Alison Pollock suggested, from widespread distrust of privately provided GP services out of ours. I think that's a major driver of people going to accident and emergency. A fifth pressure will come from these personal health care budgets. And a sixth, which should not be forgotten, is the rising share of the total NHS budget that's going to the transaction costs that you go in for when you go in for a market. For example, I'm not a betting person, but I would be happy to take a bet with anybody that you will now see advertisements by hospitals advertising the care wonderful care they give to people with chronic care. And if they don't do this, they're going to lose money to private providers who will take very expensive glossy ads showing how wonderful they are for taking care of diabetes and other conditions. And that money going into advertising is coming out of patient care. So NHS waiting times are rising again as staff cuts bite. Services are shrinking, the coverage is shrinking, and staff tempers are fraying. And in my opinion, this is how the NHS will be finally broken up. As with other public services, you first starve the service into becoming less efficient and less popular, and then you give subsidies to private companies to take the services over. As NHS services decline, and with Jeremy Hunt hypocritically blaming the nurses for it, more and more middle-class people will be tempted to go private. And the one thing that stops them is the cost of taking out private medical insurance. But, and here is the final irony, so long as everybody has the right to NHS services, private medical insurance is cheap in Britain, cheap in England. Last week I asked some friends with a young family to get a quotation for private medical insurance, and it came to £2,280 a year. The average cost for an American family of private medical insurance is £10,000 a year, plus co-payments, money you have to spend for each treatment. One reason for this huge difference, that the American is almost 5 times more costly, is that American health services in general are exorbitantly costly because of the profit that is taken out of it at every stage, because of the high transaction costs, monopolies, incentives to overtreat, and so on. This will all happen here, but it hasn't really started to bite yet. But another major reason for the difference is that when your insurance cover runs out in the United States, when the cap on it is reached, that's the end of it. That's it. You have no more access to healthcare unless you've got some other source of money. Whereas in the UK, you can switch to the NHS. And if you look at the insurance plans offered by Bupa and other insurers, they very often, many of these plans, have built into them a provision that if you choose to go to the NHS after all, they'll give you a lump sum of money. So it's the existence of the NHS as a free fallback that is a major contributor to keeping the cost of premiums down. And while that lasts, I think more and more middle-class people will be tempted to run away from the NHS because it's been given such a bad press and because it is indeed being squeezed and go private. Those who can afford it will take out private medical insurance. Free provision will be gradually scaled down to a level that the affluent middle class see as good enough for the poor, while it still serves as an ultimate safety net for themselves. So what can we do about it? Well, in the long run, the NHS is going to have to be rebuilt. That's all there is to it.
Yeah.
It was built by Baron Bevan and the Labour movement back in the 40s, and it's going to have to be rebuilt at some time in the future. There's no other way. And that's going to happen only when enough people are angry enough and angry with the right people, angry where they see where the problem comes from. And this means we have a major educational task, such as you are carrying out here in Lewisham, magnificently. It's going to have to hang in. It's not going to be easy, but time is on our side because the NHS is going to get worse. It can't help getting worse. And we have to point the finger where it should be pointed and get people to understand that this basic human need and human right is being taken away in the interests of the profits of the private sector. So that's a long-run task. In the short run, I personally think that what we can do is to demand honesty. This whole process has been based on lies, big lies and little lies at every stage, and we have to highlight this. And the reason I say that is that I think that people are not usually roused to become active just because they face material difficulties. It's when they feel they're being treated unjustly that they really get angry. It's when their self-respect is at stake. And in my opinion, our self-respect is being abused every day by this process. I think, therefore, the key issues here are democratic issues as much as economic. The outrageous behavior of the peers voting for legislation in their own financial interest should become a major campaigning issue. So should the refusal to make private healthcare companies which provide NHS services to NHS patients are subject to the Freedom of Information Act. Why should we not know how our money is being spent just because it's a private company and not an NHS hospital? The Act allows us to know what NHS providers do. It doesn't allow us to know what the increasing number of private providers will be doing, and so on. I personally don't think that if Labour wins in 2015, it is going to repeal much of Lansley's Act. I hope I'm wrong, but that's my anxious feeling about it. But I think it could perhaps be forced, and should be forced, to promise to make changes on these democratic issues. And if they are made, it makes our long-run job much easier, much less difficult. So I think we should